light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I wanted to offer some thoughts and reflections on the idea of suffering in relationship to spirituality, or in terms of spiritual purification or spiritual growth and evolution. It seems to be not just in Christianity, but especially within Christianity in pre-modern times, though continuing today to some extent too, a perception, a belief that experiencing pain somehow purifies the spirit. Experiencing suffering somehow elevates the thoughts, as if the spirit and the body were adversarial to each other instead of being two sides of the same coin. Personally, I choose to believe that holistic health includes the health of the body and of the spirit, and that pain and suffering may or may not be educational, but they are not in any case required. If they do come, obviously they can come on their own merits. They don't need to be encouraged. If they do come, what really matters is how we respond to them. The older belief was essentially always placing the body and the spirit against each other as if they were adversaries. That in order to be spiritually pure, you had to somehow denigrate the body, and that if you somehow celebrated the body too much, it was at the detriment of your spirit. It would somehow take something away from your spirituality. There are very few debates or discussions that don't have very strong arguments on both sides. So what I hope to present in the next half hour throughout this show is just ways of scratching the surface and encouraging thought, not of trying to claim either side is right or wrong, and within what context or to what degree. There were a lot of times, especially in the early Middle Ages, from what I understand, where people would engage in whipping themselves and all sorts of bodily torments and injuries, ostensibly to, especially within Christianity, to somehow take on, if you will, the sufferings of Christ. There have been rumors, and I was unable to find anything to substantiate it one way or the other, of whether certain religious orders over the years specifically avoided what were considered modern sanitary effective medical practices, that in ministering to the sick and dying, they didn't really minister as medically correctly or medically ethically as they could have, specifically because the religious order had no objection to suffering per se, because they saw suffering as a means to spiritual purification. So that in helping the sick and dying, it wasn't necessarily to make them healthy people or to put an end to their sickness or to make their dying painless, but it was rather to help them or to encourage them to see their sickness and their suffering as vehicles to spiritual refinement, that by going through this suffering, when they arrived in heaven or in the next world, that they would somehow be elevated or empowered specifically because of all the suffering they had endured. On one level, on a human level, I suppose I'm outraged by the notion that pain or suffering would be so ignored and tolerated, that care of the body would be done so recklessly and negligently and irresponsibly. On the other hand, I can see the association that would be made intellectually that, there are people who have actually endured carrying a cross and having nails pounded through their wrists so that they could describe themselves as having experienced the sufferings of Jesus Christ. The problem I guess I would have with that, as with any mystical experience, is the notion that anyone can take on someone else's mystical experiences. Assuming that the synoptic gospel record is historically correct, that there was a man named Jesus and this was the way he was killed and so forth, and trying to guess how accurate the descriptions are to what the practices of the time were, which seems to vary slightly from one anthropologist to the next. The experience that Jesus had, if all of that is true, was uniquely Jesus' experience. If everybody else, all the apostles described in the four Gospels, if 100 other early Christian fathers, as they're referred to, the founders of what eventually became the Christian religion, if they all went through the exact same experience, and then everyone was sent to a separate room to write down a journal of their experience afterwards, I seriously doubt that they would be writing the same story. Each one would have his own unique experience of how it felt, of what thoughts meaning of it was, of whether it was a sacrificial atonement or a political persecution, or what the meaning of it was, or whether the suffering itself had any meaning at all. There's also various things that happen within the brain during intense suffering, some of which can bring on visions or hallucinations, altered states of consciousness. I don't know that any of us is in a position to say to what extent those visions are true or not. Did Jesus really appear as this person of light to Paul on the road to Damascus, as recorded in the book of Acts? Or was it simply that Paul had sunstroke, fell down, had an altered state of consciousness, and God spoke to Paul's mind? It could be either of those or any of 100 other explanations. The point was, Paul had a perception that changed his life. Going back to our topic of dealing with suffering and spirituality, yes, the pain does bring on altered states of consciousness. Yes, the brain responds with different chemicals trying to help the body survive the experience of that much intensity of pain. Is there a separate spiritual reality that meshes with that? That when you go to this altered state of consciousness, that it really is God or an angel or Jesus or whomever that you're seeing. That it is not just a fabrication of your own mind. We simply don't have any way of measuring that one way or the other. We don't have an external point of reference where we can say, yes, there were angels present, or no, they were not. Because we don't have a Geiger counter for angels, if you will. At one time, we didn't have a Geiger counter to tell us whether or not there was radiation present. We had to take it on faith. Now we have a Geiger counter. Maybe at some point we'll come up with something that can detect the presence of certain more subtle energies that tell us whether or not there are ghosts or spirits or angels within a particular room. I don't know. That's for some future inventor to figure out, I guess. Even if we never invent an angelic Geiger counter, it doesn't mean the angels aren't there. And if we do, it doesn't mean there might be other angels with a slightly different energy signature that would require a different invention to detect them. But all of which is more tangential speculation. For the moment, the question remains, if one buys into that earlier understanding of spiritual purification, if engaging in suffering is going to create spiritual refinement of some sort, or greater spiritual ability, or somehow make you God's favorite or something. And I guess to me, as I've turned this and related subjects over in my head over and over and over and questioned them from every angle, the one conclusion I keep coming back to is that life is primarily about the growth of the soul. So it's really not from that perspective, it's not so much a question of whether you suffer or whether you don't, as what you learn from whatever you experience. If you suffer at all, what did you learn from it? If you suffer a lot, what did you learn from it? If you only suffered a little, what did you learn from it? What did it tell you about yourself? What did it allow you to see that you wouldn't have otherwise seen? Or were you so busy reaching for painkillers to dim the awareness and just escape the experience that you never thought about learning anything at all? Does that mean we should not try to avoid pain? I'm not saying that either, because I know there are destructive side effects to pain where it becomes impossible to think or feel or to learn anything until an altered state of consciousness is achieved, or until the pain is past. There's no ability to even think about what the experience included. It becomes mind-numbing. It becomes blinding. It becomes something that you desperately hope will never be repeated. To the extent that some have said this is something that will make you more spiritually pure, I think they were reaching for an explanation that would allow them to cope with it more effectively. An explanation, everything that's challenging to us, to humanity, the first impulse of the human mind is to try to make some sort of sense of it. And only when we make sense of it does it become even minimally tolerable. The more painful an experience is, the more important it becomes to us to somehow make sense of it, to give it a meaning that we don't have to consider ourselves a victim. We don't have to tell ourselves, God must hate me. It's understandable to want to escape the pain, avoid the pain, prevent the pain, whatever. But if the pain is there anyway, or if it is there at all, to dismiss it before you even learn anything from it. To dismiss it in a way that you learn nothing from it. It's not that you have to wait a while. It's that, I guess I'm still saying it shouldn't be dismissed. It shouldn't be encouraged, but it shouldn't be dismissed. Because if you dismiss it, something that may have dominated your life for days, months, or weeks, or for some people for years, that to consider how it has shaped you, how it has influenced you, that how even reaching for some way to stop the pain is an expression of self-love, an expression of trying to take good care of the vessel, the body with which you've been entrusted to carry your spirit through this life. It's when you understand, I guess, that suffering is not an end in itself. And suffering doesn't necessarily even have a relationship with spiritual purification. The spiritual purification is not caused by the suffering, but may be coincidental with the suffering because of what you learn about suffering and about life experience, about being in a body. You may even be giving thanks that you still feel something, because there are some ailments, some ways that the body can be broken where you lose feeling and you don't even know for certain whether you're still there. Pain is something that will wake us up, that will remind us that we are alive, that if we weren't still alive, it wouldn't be hurting anymore. But that if we are alive, there's a message in that it's trying to convey. Something's wrong in some particular area of the body. Can you address it? And if you can't address it, how do you come to terms with your own helplessness? That too is another potential lesson. Coming to terms with the helplessness of not being able to snap your fingers and make the pain go away. Then looking at how experiencing pain in our lives may be a lesson for those around us. Maybe that they're watching to see how we handle it, how much we handle it, and to some extent how much we handle it the way they expect us to handle it. And if we don't, whether that challenges them to rethink their position on pain, to rethink their conclusions about the significance of pain, or whether they choose to avoid growth and not think about it at all. Ultimately, I think what shows the most love, the most wisdom, the most dedication to spiritual purification and growth is being willing to wrestle with the question at all. It's not so important what answer you come up with as that you're not in a hurry to dismiss the question. That if I am going to endure this much pain, and if by some definition or other God really loves me, then there must be a really, really good reason for this happening. And if so, can I figure out what that reason is? All that being said, of course, the next nice thing is when the pain does go away. The thing I guess to remember about pain, as about every oppressive or difficult circumstance, is that they are not eternal. They're absolutely bound by time. Pain may last for a long time, but it will only last for a certain time. Pain is not eternal. Brokenness is not eternal. Wholeness and love and wisdom and memories, those are eternal. The other thing I want to be really careful to say in all of this discussion is that it's not about ignoring others' pain just so that they can learn something from it. It's because there's also the simultaneous opportunity that they and you might learn more from you helping them in whatever ways you can, rather than in being complacent and apathetic toward their painful experience. I had someone tell me once that in order to do their work, artists need to suffer. And on one hand, I would have to concede that there is an awful lot of overlap of suffering and artistic creation. On the other hand, it really bothered me that this particular person was using that as an excuse to be totally apathetic toward all artists. That as long as he could say artists need to suffer in order to do their creative work, any suffering artist who crossed his path didn't need to be helped. And in a sense, it was almost like he was attempting to say that if he helped them, he would interfere with their artistic purpose in life. I don't know, in a way that demonizes expressions of love. To say that we shouldn't love someone or help them simply because we may be interfering with their experience of pain and suffering, that seems very backward to me, because somewhere over and above all of that is the basic principle of love. Which in my understanding, love would basically say that if you encounter anyone who is in pain or suffering, you do whatever you can to help them. That's the nature of love. And if you don't help them, then you're denying that love is part of your nature. The suffering of love, however, is that recognition, that acknowledgement that no matter how much you love someone, there's some things you simply can't do for them. One of my early witticisms was that whoever wants the muscles must lift the weights. No matter how much you love someone, you can't lift the weights for them and have them build their muscles. They have to lift their own weights in order to have stronger muscles. There's a number of things that we simply have to do for ourselves. It doesn't mean that we don't have the support and encouragement of people around us, of friends, family, community. It doesn't mean that we don't do whatever we can. But it does mean that there are some things that even with an abundance of love, even with an abundance of resources, there are still certain things that we have to do for ourselves, that we have to do on our own. If we want bigger muscles, we have to lift the weights, we have to do the exercises. Suffering itself may in fact be a kind of exercise, inviting the spirit to strengthen itself in focus, resolve, in all sorts of things. I still don't think that we need to seek suffering or create suffering for that reason, because there is already enough suffering in the basic dynamics of life that will find you, if you're involved in it all. The only way to avoid all suffering is essentially to stop living, to withhold, to refrain from any social connection whatsoever, to refrain from pursuing any ambition. The thing that makes it a little confusing, though, is that people who have suffered often come out as having spiritually grown, and too often those who admire the result attribute the effect to suffering as the cause, when the suffering may have been merely coincidental and not actually causative. The thing that actually caused it wasn't the suffering itself, but the choices and the interpretations and the ways that the person experiencing the suffering made sense of the experience in order to keep going, in order to continue their life in some way. Instead of lying down and starving to death, insisting that God has abandoned me, to simply say, I don't know why this came along, I don't know what its ultimate significance is, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it even, I'm just making it up as I go. And in that place of not knowing, to pursue an infusion, if you will, of wisdom and love. The infusion of wisdom and love in those moments basically takes that suffering like a lump of gray, slimy clay on a potter's wheel and begins to shape it into a beautiful vessel that, it takes a lot of persistence, a lot of tolerance for getting one's hands dirty, to shape that clay and draw it up into the shape it's supposed to be off the potter's wheel. And even at that point, then to see it as part of a longer process, that it then has to be cut from the wheel and allowed to dry, and then fired in a kiln, and then glazed and finished and fired again. The process that a ceramic pot goes through is really quite involved. Considering that a allegedly lifeless clay pot goes through that kind of process in order to become fine porcelain, it only makes sense that something as complex as a human being, with abilities for metaphor and language and meaning and symbolism and worship and spirituality, that these would be even more complicated. Not because they have to be complicated, but because they simply have lots of pieces and parts, lots of variables, lots of details that all work together to make it happen. As we wind all this up, I guess, on one hand, I don't want to be patronizing. On the other hand, I don't want to be apathetic. I respect each individual's right to choose whatever means to spiritual purification they want. But I would caution people against assuming that performing some painful physical activity will in fact grant the spiritual evolution they seek, just because some religious administrator reported that it would. Or in some cases, just because some religious administrator reported that making donations to the church, that essentially putting a price tag on your absolution or forgiveness, that really has any validity. The other contrast, I guess I wanted to throw in all this, it's kind of a weird extra loop here at the end, but the Protestant notion, starting in the Protestant Reformation, that obviously not all Protestant churches share today, that the suffering somehow becomes the motivation for spiritual purification. There are denominations that even now will talk about how horrible hell is in an effort to essentially scare people into doing what that particular church directs in order to be assured of heaven. The problem with this is you basically got someone trying to get into heaven using a vehicle of fear. But the Bible itself says that perfect love casts out fear. And so it would seem to me that since God is love and fear is not admissible there, those who think they're going to heaven purely out of fear won't get in, or they'll be immediately cast out. But that's assuming a very traditional judgment of who are the good ones and who are the bad ones. My point in mentioning all that is simply to say that fear is not a good reason. Fear is not something, in my opinion, that will support positive spiritual growth. Suffering in and of itself is not something, in my personal opinion, that will support spiritual growth or spiritual purification. What makes the difference is not how much it hurts or how much you suffer, but rather what you learn about your soul and about relating to the divine while you're doing it. In any case, thank you very much for watching today. I hope I've offered some thoughts to get your own thoughts going and decide what you think about this very complex subject. But thank you very much for watching.